This is one I've been working on for quite a while. I really wanted to delve into the facts and nuances of the link between mental illness and violent crime. The left keeps screaming that we need to keep guns out of the hands of the mentally ill. But as we keep pointing out, not only are mentally ill people no more likely to commit acts of violence than the rest of the population, they are 10 times as likely to become victims of violence. So really, you'd just be disarming a victim class. Now, that fact alone should be enough for any reasonable person, but if there are any reasonable people still on the left, they aren't having much of an effect on the agenda being pushed. So I thought I'd dive in deeper and take a look at what the actual science behind all of this is. First of all, let me take care of a fallacy. The claim is made, over and over again, that you'd have to be mentally ill to commit a mass shooting. But this is begging the question. You don't get to have the conclusion embedded in your premise. Mental illness refers to any diagnosable disorder that impairs functioning in some way. It isn't just being evil. If a person wants to be evil, he doesn't need a mental illness to do it. In fact, a mental illness would actually get in the way of his evil goals. Also, a study published in the Journal of Abnormal Psychology found that 41% of people have developed some kind of mental disorder by the time they reach 38. And those are just the diagnosed ones. The study found it probable that everyone suffers from a mental disorder of some kind and to some degree at some point in their lives. Sometimes it's short-term, sometimes it lasts several years. Usually it's not a long-term problem, but the fact is, if you're going to use any diagnosed mental disorder as an excuse to stop someone from getting guns, what you're talking about really does amount to a full-on gun ban. And you have ridiculous claims like blaming the Mandalay Bay shooter's anxiety disorder. Folks, an anxiety disorder does not make you shoot up a bunch of people. It makes you curl up in a ball on the floor or otherwise freeze you into inaction, not action. Whatever was going on in the shooter's head that day, it was not an anxiety attack. Likewise, it's hard to see how depression could make someone engage in a mass shooting. Depression would make someone say to themselves, "Oh, what's the point?" and stay at home. There's also a statistical fallacy going on here as well. The fallacy causes people to look at what percentage of A are B when they really need to look at what percentage of B are A. In this case, they look at the number of shooters with a diagnosable illness, which is really cherry-picking because they don't compare it to the portion who don't, and that's most of them, and think that they can conclude that this means that a significant portion of mentally ill people are in danger of becoming mass shooters. To see why this is a fallacy, I'm going to lift an analogy from my response to that guy T's video on immigration. He posited a hypothetical college campus with a certain number of rapes, say 50. It's discovered that all 50 rapes were committed by members of this one fraternity. What should you conclude? Should action be taken against this fraternity? Many would say yes, but they're engaging in this fallacy. Even if 100% of the rapes are committed by fraternity members, it does not follow that most members of the fraternity are rapists. It could be just one guy who committed all of those rapes, who just happened to be a member of that one fraternity. Even if 100% of A are B, it still doesn't give you any indication what percentage of B are A. What percentage of rapists are fraternity members tells you nothing about how many fraternity members are rapists. By the same token, the number of mass shootings committed by mentally ill people tells you nothing about what percentage of mentally ill people are in danger of committing a mass shooting. The statistic doesn't tell you anything about that. So what can we conclude about violence and mental illness? The first significant study to look at this issue while avoiding the methodological mistakes of past assessments was the MacArthur Violence Risk Assessment Study, which looked at 1,000 people every 10 weeks for a year after leaving a psychiatric inpatient ward. They found that 18% of people with a psychiatric disorder committed at least one act of violence in a year. But then they controlled for just one factor: location. They looked at the patient's neighborhoods to control for both environmental and socioeconomic factors. And once they did that, the effect disappeared. They found no significant difference in the number of violent acts between the subjects of the study and mentally healthy people living in the same neighborhood. What's interesting about this study is that when the mentally ill person was also a substance abuser, the rate of violence went from 18% to 31%. This is known as dual diagnosis theory. the idea that mental illness is one risk factor that can increase when combined with another. But this same study found that, after controlling for substance abuse rates, factors common to a particular neighborhood are all that is needed to explain the differences, and mental illness doesn't even get a look in. In fact, alcohol and drug abuse can increase the risk of someone committing an act of violence 7-fold, even among people with no history of mental illness. There are 2 disorders in particular that people point to and blame for shootings: bipolar disorder and schizophrenia. In 2 studies, the University of Oxford analyzed data from Sweden. In Sweden, everyone is identified by a particular number that let researchers determine how many mentally ill people were convicted of crimes and match them to control groups. They found that people with schizophrenia or bipolar disorder were marginally but significantly more likely to commit violent crimes when compared to the average population. However, when they compared these mentally affected individuals to their unaffected siblings, the differences went away, demonstrating that environmental or genetic elements were responsible, not the mental illness. And the MacArthur study shows that psychotic and delusional thoughts are not associated with higher levels of violence. That was also the finding of the National Epidemiologic Study on Alcohol and Related Conditions, published in JAMA Psychology, which studied how mental illnesses led to violent behavior in Americans. With a sample size of over 34,000 subjects, they found that mental illness was not a predictor of future violence. Based on these and other studies, clinicians consider the following criteria when assessing a patient's risk of violent activity. 1. The patient's history of violence. Makes sense. If you committed violence in the past, you're more likely to in the future. That's true even if the person doesn't have a mental illness. 2. The patient's history of risk factors. Were they abused as a child? Were their parents ever arrested for acts of violence? Is there any other history of victimization, as well as other stressful factors such as divorce or unemployment? 3. Substance abuse, particularly alcohol. Alcohol can trigger violent behavior even in people who don't have a mental illness. Alcohol can also interact badly with many mental health drugs, and alcoholics are also less likely to stick to their treatment. 4. Dispositional factors. This is things like age, sex, income, education level, all things that can have an effect on one's potential for violence. But gun control advocates want to use mental illness alone as a reason to restrict someone's Second Amendment rights. They want a gun dealer to find out whether or not someone has a mental illness before selling them a weapon. First of all, how is this not a HIPAA violation? Mental patients have the right to their medical privacy just like everyone else. But you want a list of everyone with a mental illness. What could possibly go wrong? Tell you what, we'll just have Equifax manage that list. How do you feel about that? Oh, you think government can do better? Remember the Office of Personnel Management? Not only should gun control people actually learn about guns and real crime statistics, they need to learn about real mental health statistics as well, and stop listening to the sensationalism about it in the news media. A study from Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health published in Health Affairs pointed out that only about 4% of interpersonal violence in the U.S. can be attributable to mental illness, yet 40% of news stories about mental illness connect it to violent behavior. Also, the percentage of stories about mass shootings that depicted the shooters as mentally ill increased from 9% to 22% over the course of a decade. But out of all of these stories, only 8% of them pointed out that most people with mental illnesses are not violent. The researchers concluded, research suggests that this policy approach will not meaningfully address gun violence in America and might reinforce the link between mental illness and violence in the public psyche. So, to recap, people with mental illnesses are no more likely to commit acts of violence than the general population, but they are 10 times as likely to be victims of violence. 41% of the population is diagnosed with a mental disorder by age 38, at least in the short term, and when the undiagnosed are included, the real number might even encompass everyone. Some disorders like anxiety and depression actually make violent acts less likely. Psychotic and delusional thoughts are not associated with a higher risk of violent acts. Most examples of violence committed by someone with a mental disorder are more attributable to other risk factors such as substance abuse or environmental or genetic factors. A psychiatric registry would seriously violate the privacy of mental health patients suffering from very personal and sensitive disorders. A central registry would also open up the possibility of the information being hacked and made available worldwide. The news media sensationalizes mental illness stories with connections to violence that are completely unwarranted and does not give you the truth about how low a risk factor mental illness actually is. And finally, a policy of restricting guns to people with a diagnosed mental illness will do absolutely nothing to address the issue of gun violence or mass shootings, and will merely disarm a victim class. There really is no defense of this policy that holds any water whatsoever. So thank you for watching, and if you found this video enlightening, please hit like and subscribe, and use the links below to give a one-time donation via PayPal or crypto, or even become a regular supporter through Patreon. Also, let me know your thoughts in the comments, and we'll see if we can finally have a rational discussion on this issue. Until next time, stay strong and be free.